Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of the Wally Pod, a show where I interview my peers who are embarking on their careers in areas from investment banking to software engineering to entrepreneurship and more. We explore the lessons they learn navigating college, their plan for future success, and the views they hold on the future of the world as the next generation that is taking the reins. Subscribe to join me weekly for informational and motivating interviews. If you've enjoyed the podcast so far, I'd really appreciate it if you could forward it on to one other person that you think would enjoy it as well. The shows are much more fun for me to make when I know that I have an audience. I've also created an email newsletter that will keep you up to date on the newest episodes. The link to sign up is in the description. Now, in this episode, we talk with my friend Jenna Scheffert discussing her path from fashion to consulting to investment banking. She tells us about her experiences abroad in Venice, Paris, Hong Kong, and Brussels, from fashion school to fighting Russian disinformation. Jenna has a fascinating college experience, so without further ado, here's our conversation. Jenna, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And you are certainly one of the most well-rounded and involved people I know. So we have a lot to talk about, but let's get started with the end of your high school career. You grew up in a small town in Minnesota and you graduated in 2015 and took a gap year at a fashion school in Venice. So how in the world did that happen? And was that your plan all through high school?
So I never directly had a plan to, go to a fashion school, live in a foreign country for a year. That just sort of came to be. But I grew up in a household where my father did Peace Corps for 2 years after college. And that was always a prominent point growing up in terms of values and how he saw the world. And I was inspired by his sort of viewpoint, his mindset. And he actually encouraged me to sign up for a program called Rotary Youth Exchange, where you can become an exchange student in a different country. You can't necessarily guarantee which country you're going to be sent to or which type of school you may attend, but I was pretty vocal about going to Italy and my interest in fashion, and so they made the two align, and I was thankful for that. I went to a fully immersive Italian school. I stayed with 3 different host families who only spoke Italian. I was met with different barriers that I hadn't necessarily encountered before. And so I ended up going to this fashion school, and I would definitely say this one gap year was the best year of my life. And it definitely changed sort of my course, my viewpoint moving forward, and how I participated and acted in college, so to speak.
So is that why you found it to be the best year of your life, a new perspective change on the world and confidence in yourself to persevere in the face of adversity?
Definitely. So I'm somebody who I fully believe that travel can change a person. Really having the struggles and the emotions to sort of understand the world around you. So for example, when I first went to Italy, I went in September and it came back in July. So it's just short of a year. But basically, my host families didn't speak any English. So for me to be an American student going over there with a limited knowledge of Italian, I had to concentrate on the words I wanted to say, the emotions I wanted to relay, the actions I did all spoke for me. And so it was the first time in my life where you're sort of put in an uncomfortable situation and you're having to work through that the best you can from, say, a limited background. And so it was a liberating year in terms of my time to figure out who I am, what I want to see in the world, what I want to do, and then come back and make that happen, basically.
I imagine it was really frustrating not being able to speak the language. What was that like?
It was very frustrating. And someone who spoke many words and pride themselves on sort of being a voice in high school. I basically went from giving my high school graduation speech to being speechless in front of the Italian country. And so I definitely struggled with that, but I think that definitely made me a stronger person and sort of changed the way I speak in my vernacular. So for example, if I didn't know a word in Italian, I would use an analogy to sort of illustrate that and get the point across what I was trying to say. And so now when I speak, I use a lot of analogies just subconsciously, and they don't necessarily all need to be involved, but that was just how I fought through those difficult and challenging times, in terms of when I wanted to articulate myself, but just didn't know how. So it was a challenge, but it was in the end worth it.
I can't imagine. I think people have a hard enough time switching from high school to college. What advice do you have for people in high school thinking about doing a gap year and how they can best go about picking the right program and whether they should even do it or not?
I would say go for it. I think it takes a large leap of faith, but in the end, it will pay off. I think it's a very difficult decision because a lot of people are ready to move on in this linear pattern with their friends, and they've checked the box of high school. Now they're ready to move on to college. But the gap year is sort of that 1 year where you have time to pause and to figure out what you want to do with your life. So I would highly encourage anyone thinking about it to just go for it and look into different programs, figure out a few of your interests. What are your hobbies? What have you been percolating in terms of ideas of something you may want to do later on? And figure out the logistics behind that and put yourself out there. It's a challenging sort of year and it's not easy, but I mean, when you get over this hump and you figure out you don't have to translate in terms of the language, you can figure out a new culture and take that back with you. I think that's something that you'll never regret, and it's always something that you'll be thankful for. So I would definitely encourage anyone who's even thinking about it to look further into it.
Yeah, I think it's not a big enough thing. It's something that I actually wish I would have done too. I wish it would have been more of a discussion at the end of high school.
And I'm thankful that it is starting to be a discussion too. So I think it's growing, which is good. I think I went to basically another year of education and a whole new country. So it wasn't just a year of partying. It wasn't just a year of necessarily working or hanging low. I mean, it was a challenging year, but I'm glad that the narrative is changing on that and that it's becoming more focal point and discussions are being made, because I highly encourage it.
Yeah, I think you probably get a tremendous amount of growth during that period, and which is excellent going into college because you have to make so many decisions early on in college. Which brings us to you going to Wisconsin. You said you might have been considering going to fashion school, but you ended up going to the business school at Wisconsin. What was your thought process there, and what was it like going to Wisconsin after a full year in Venice?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a change, but it was also back home, so to speak. When I was looking at colleges in high school, I was looking at different factors and what did I value the most and sort of where could I see myself long term and what college university would help me get there. And that's where I ended up applying to a multitude of different schools, but narrowed it down to U of M and University of Wisconsin based on basically the finances that were involved, and financial aid. I think the cost of education is something that should definitely be addressed. And so when I went to Italy, then I thought, okay, now I'm going out to see the world. I'm obviously broadening my perspective. But at the same time, I was excited to come back home and to a place where I'm a drive away from my parents or from my family. And so Italy was great, but communication, obviously you're overseas, it can be sad at times, birthdays, holidays. And so I was excited to basically get back to a place that was still new, which I found with the University of Wisconsin, but it wasn't close enough where my parents could pop in on the weekends or force me to do laundry at home. So I was excited to go to University of Wisconsin. And then the business school was intriguing. I had also looked at Carlson heavily, and that was in my final decision set. But given sort of the academics combined with the athletics and the environment at Madison, I was much more drawn towards that. But then, like you said, I had considered fashion at one point, and in school, I actually had half my day in this Italian school was normal subjects. So I had my organic chemistry, I had calculus, I had the whole plethora of what you'd get in high school. But my other half was workroom. So that's where I was picking out patterns and fabrics. I was drawing on blueprints. I was measuring out what I wanted to do. And then I was doing fashion history. I was economics of fashion. I mean, it's a very spotlighted approach to the fashion industry. But my time in the workroom in the lab, I realized I just was not as interested as I thought I once was about it. So I was kind of figuring out what aspect of fashion I actually enjoyed, because when you break it down, get into the granular facts of it, I'm not as interested in the pen to paper drawing. I'm not as interested in how to sew a button onto a shirt. And so it's all these things that we did, but it felt more like chores to me. And so I figured out at this school that I was drawn towards numbers and realized that numbers were a universal language. And that was something where I could connect with the students, and my professor the best was through our calculus class. And I was fortunate that I took calculus in high school, so I had that background. It was pretty easy. I could basically get by without studying or doing anything for that. And so it just kind of was my one avenue where I exerted more energy. And that's where I figured, why not combine a career of fashion and business? And the University of Wisconsin had a neat business school where I was thankful I got into right away, but it also allowed me to kind of picture those other aspects that were important to me, such as being close to home and having the nature and the athletics and everything involved. So I just landed on the University of Wisconsin because I felt like it was the best fit for me at the time. I'm happy with my choice. I'm happy to where it led me and the doorways that it opened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I had a super similar thought process for coming to Wisconsin too, from Minnesota. It's a good distance from home. Like you said, parents can't drop in.
Yeah, that was important.
You didn't stay in the country for long though, because the following summer you headed off to France. What was the story there?
So I actually studied abroad through the business school after freshman year in Paris. I was anxious to get back. I kind of, when when you go abroad, you see the world, and then you come back to this state school in Wisconsin, and it's great, but you just kind of realize the mindset is a bit different within the student body, within maybe the values that the school's preaching. And so I was anxious to get back out and see the world. And I sort of enjoy the learning process and taking everything in. And so I'm also very strategic and futuristic, and often those two clash. And so when I was a freshman, I was thinking, what can I do freshman summer to land me a good internship for next year? Or what can I do to land me a good internship for the future? And so I was trying to be strategic. And when I went to the career fair and obviously got shut down being a freshman, putting myself out there, I was thinking, okay, well, let me take some classes. Let me get ahead in school. I hear that you can sign up for classes the next year ahead of others. And so I'm laughing now, but my thought process was basically like, I'm going to knock out some classes after freshman year. Why stop now? So I signed up for this fashion marketing program in Paris that sort of allowed me to dip my toes into the fashion business world, of which I was excited about. And from there, I took a basic French course and a global marketing course. And that specific global marketing course was the first marketing course that really broadened my perspective and allowed me to think, okay, marketing might be a pathway for me. So I enjoyed my professor, I enjoyed the students I was surrounded by, and it also combined sort of the fashion industry. So we were going to different warehouses, different museums. We were learning about what made the fashion brand name so popular in France, and then how did it basically disperse around the world. And so it was a neat experience and allowed me to basically kill two birds, one stone, get some classes out of the way and concrete this idea of fashion and business.
So you were in kind of two of the big fashion capitals of the world, in France and Italy. How do they compare? How do your experiences compare? Obviously, you're at different points in your life, even though they were only about a year apart.
Yeah, they were very different. My experience in school is basically, I was dropped into this fashion school in Italy as the first foreign exchange student I ever had. I was the new shiny token nobody knew how to communicate with or what to do. And so that was more of a challenge versus Paris. I went on a program exchange. So instead of going to a university, I was set up with a third party there who had rented this space and they had provided these instructors and they were showing us around, but it was different in the sense that I was being handed more items and I was being led into these different fashion outlets. But in Italy, I was the one who had to go and be more proactive about that. And it was more me versus more of a program. So very different experiences. And then I realized that the program was great. I'm very thankful for it. But looking forward to another exchange or opportunity abroad, I was looking for that exchange experience in terms of going to a school and trying to blend in as one of the students, as opposed to being held and patted on the head by this program.
So it sounds like at this point you're at a pretty pivotal point pertaining to your career decisions during college. What was it that caused you to shift your goals away from fashion more towards the business world, and specifically finance and consulting?
Well, I came to this conclusion with fashion that it doesn't have the impact I want to make on the world. And so I I personally don't care about the headline of a t-shirt or the exact button with a specific sewing pattern in terms of how it lays on a pair of pants. That just to me was granular and did not affect anyone else. And I, for one, did not care about it. And so I was thinking, okay, I want to go into a business, into an industry where my reach is broader. I have a greater impact. And maybe I want to push aside fashion into, plant it back into the hobbies. And so from there, I was thinking, what's a pathway that will allow me to continue to see the world, sort of pique my interests on different facets. It's hard now to narrow down. I always thought I wanted with a singular vision of fashion is for me, therefore I will go into fashion. But I've had a ton of interest growing up and I just continued to feed them until I went into fashion. And I just realized I was blinded by it early on. So I went back into, I sort of like opened the realm of possibilities of what did I want to major in? What do I want to do with my life? What sort of career path is best for me? And that's where I landed on this idea of finance. Again, I was always drawn towards numbers, gravitated towards them in high school. In Italy, it was awakening. But then I realized what part of business allows me to sort of continue to see different aspects. I, again, didn't want to narrow it back down to fashion. I was kind of fighting that urge. And so I realized that with consulting and both investment banking, they're two fields that have steep learning curves, allow me to continue learning, and no day's ever the same. So I was immediately drawn towards those.
Next up, spring of sophomore year, you decided to head off to the other side of the world to study on exchange in Hong Kong. What was that experience like, and why did you pick Asia in the first place?
Yeah, I was very excited to go to Hong Kong. Asia had been on my bucket list. I felt that growing up, I'd been fortunate to see other parts of the world. I'd knocked Africa off my list after my dad had worked there through the Peace Corps. And so he took us back there as a family. I'd seen India, I'd seen all these different nooks and crannies of the world, except Asia was a huge emerging, obviously well-established market now, but it was an emerging sphere for me that I knew nothing about. I sort of had different assumptions and expectations for what it'd be like. And I learned that anytime I have those thoughts of a country, they are always broken when I get there. And so I was excited to go to Hong Kong specifically, as it is a financial hub in the Southeastern Hemisphere. And I figured that might help give me a leg up in terms of recruiting and job market. And again, allow me to understand the thought process and the business model behind the Asian businesses. So I specifically honed in on Hong Kong, and then I was looking for different exchange programs where I found Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, which was an amazing university, well-regarded, rigorous curriculum, and I was a minority there. I was one of the few Americans. I was excited to dive into the classes to not just knock out, I think a lot of people go abroad and knock out generals, and I think that's a smart decision, but I'm interested in what are those like particular classes that I can only get in that particular university. So I was thinking about Hong Kong and sort of what different things they're known for. And so I was excited to sort of be in that classroom and to just listen, observe, learn, and educate myself on the people and sort of the world out there. So Hong Kong was a totally different experience from the other two places I went before. It was eye-opening. I was excited to travel, very fortunate that I was able to go to multiple places on the weekends. But it was also just an opportunity to understand another culture and see how people lived on the other side of the world.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm reminiscing back on when you were giving me this exact same advice when I was deciding on going abroad. And I ended up going to the same university in Hong Kong and had an excellent experience as well. And just completely agree with everything you said right there. And going off that, as people consider their abroad experiences that they're looking to have, what advice do you have for them in choosing programs and picking a part of the world that they want to experience?
Yeah, I think it's great. Any sort of commitment or move across any sort of border is a new experience. And I think that's important for people to have. I would definitely say figure out what you value in a place, what you want to get out of it. If you're looking to basically let off steam and have a fun few months and you want to be with friends and you're worried about a language barrier, I think there are certain continents that are going to be better for you than others. But if you're looking for that new experience, you want to uncover how the world works and sort of realize how small it is and put yourself in uncomfortable situations, which ultimately make you stronger. I think then you need to look at those places that don't often get talked about. So definitely, I think there's some peer pressure involved in terms of colleges and friends and the popularity of certain names of countries, but I think it's important to look past those and to figure out at heart, what do you want to get out of it? And that's where, for me, Hong Kong was an experience that shattered my expectations. It allowed me to see the world in a different way. And for that, I'm able to grow and move forward with that, and looking forward to my next experiences that do the same for me.
That's really good advice. So at the end of sophomore year, you were in Hong Kong. You had an upcoming internship at Accenture, and you're also recruiting for investment banking at the same time. And we'll go into that in a minute, but can you tell us about how you got your Accenture internship? Was it before you went abroad, and how you were looking forward to that as you were also doing banking recruiting?
Yeah. So my timeline for internships, I'm laughing, but my timelines have been a bit skewed from maybe the traditional. So in terms of Accenture, my sophomore year summer, I actually did a business competition, a case competition freshman year. And my team ended up winning, and we were guaranteed first round interviews with Accenture. So I did this business competition the fall of sophomore year. And here in the spring, I moved on to the next round, still had contacts at Accenture, freshman year, granted. And towards the end of summer, I reached out again and was just like, hey, remember you promised these first round internships. And unfortunately, Accenture had just cut ties with the University of Wisconsin at that time. So doors were closed. People looking to recruit there did not have great experiences. But I sort of pushed my contact I knew there and said, listen, I would love the opportunity to interview first round. So contacted him throughout the summer. And then in early fall of my sophomore year, I ended up interviewing through the phone with Accenture, moved on to the next round, and just kept moving on. And finally, I was presented this Accenture consulting internship for my sophomore year. So I recruited early. I can't even say I recruited for that one. That one was just sort of who would have guessed a door would open upon winning a case competition. But that's how it worked out for me. And then my next timeline too was pretty early on in the process.
Yeah. So before we talk about your internship that summer, do you want to talk about banking recruiting while you were in Hong Kong? That must have been, I imagine it was stressful and hard to manage networking and interviews being on the other side of the world. Although I'm sure you had a pretty interesting story for the people you were talking to.
Well, I should probably correct you on the recruiting and the networking. So that was 0 to none. Actually, I had joined investment banking only because freshman year, here I am, this giddy freshman, excited to see the world, do everything as much as possible. And I ended up going to this freshman forum with Goldman Sachs, and I met two people who were in IBC, Rachel A. and Tommy Costello. And so they were kind of confused. They were like, how did you get to this Goldman Sachs retreat? How, like, do you know anything about banking? And I was just like, listen, I do not, but I'm excited for this opportunity. I will learn, as much as I can right after this conference. But the whole conference, I knew zero what I was doing. But anyways, they said, well, you should look into investment banking club. We need people that are interested in finance. We think you'd be a good fit. So why don't you do that? So I listened to their advice. I didn't even know there were multiple rounds of interviews for this club or that it may have held some prestige at one point. I just sort of went there, talked to some people, went through the interview system, and then was in this new class of people. So when everyone starts talking about finance recruiting and investment banking recruiting and how stressful it is, I didn't necessarily go through that. So I was very fortunate to continue applying and putting my name out there to these programs. Just like freshman year, I followed suit sophomore year. And so I was like, you know what, why not put my name in this women's diversity program for Rothschild and Goldman Sachs? And I just remember being home over winter break and I was applying to these. And, I mentioned to my parents, hey, like, I'm just going to put my name in here. And they said, why? You're going to be in Hong Kong. Are you sure? I don't think you need to apply. Don't worry about it. But I was like, you know what? These are banks. It could be a drop in the bucket if I end up flying back to one of these, but put my name in. And I was just going about school life in Hong Kong when I got all of a sudden these emails from both Goldman Sachs and Rothschild following up saying they would like interviews. Goldman Sachs, I believe I just submitted an application and they didn't get back to me for a while, but then Rothschild, I went through this whole interview process while I was in Hong Kong, while I was switching SIM cards just to get my American number up and running every day and constantly texting my dad to make sure that the bill would not be too high for this. I eventually got accepted through this interview system. And that's when I had to send this email to HR that said, hello, thank you for this offer. Just to confirm, I am in Hong Kong looking for a flight from Hong Kong to any of the 3 airports in New York. Don't worry about it. And so they replied back. I'm not sure if they thought I was joking or not, but they replied back to ensure that I was coming out of Hong Kong. And I said I was. And that's when they flew me back for this 2.5-day conference with Rothschild. I unfortunately had heard back from Rothschild first and then Goldman Sachs the next day, and both conferences were 1 day away from each other with 1 day overlap. So my most stressful point in Hong Kong was when I didn't know which conference to attend and where my loyalty stood. And I, again, didn't know anything about investment banking at this time. I was very naive to the process and how everything worked out. But I was basically very stressed about which one I wanted to go to and talking to different people, but that was the main networking I'd done. But otherwise, I ended up accepting Rothschild first, and I just thought, you know what, why not go here? They guarantee an interview on the last day, as opposed to Goldman was more of a, let me show you who we are and why you should apply to us again. So I got involved with Rothschild. They flew me back. There was a bit of a nightmare where a plane delayed in Beijing and I got sent to a hotel in the middle of the night to go on one early in the morning. And so that was a very stressful time, but I made it to New York. When I was studying abroad in Hong Kong, I was there briefly on the ground at this conference. I sort of worked through this time change. Good thing. I had adrenaline pumping because the time difference is not fun. But I basically just went through this conference. I didn't entirely know what I was doing. I remember sitting by all these stressed girls who were just talking about finals and everything. So I kind of kept pretty mum about being in Hong Kong for the semester, and then the fact that I was flying to Bali directly after this conference. And so that was a bit different. And I think I'm thankful I came in there sort of having a different angle than a lot of others. So when I was interviewing or when I was just simple chatting with people around the office, they knew me as the one who was from Hong Kong, and they said, "Oh, you're the one that flew in." And so I think they honestly just felt bad about all the time I spent on a plane. But to me, I was excited, and it sort of gave me a different pedestal in the game, I would say. But the whole experience with Rothschild completely, opened my eyes up to investment banking, what it was. I went through the interview process, and at the end, I was like, this is a company I would love to work for. I hope things work out. We'll see when I hear back from HR in a few weeks. And then I basically left, went on my way back to Hong Kong, forgot about it for a few weeks. So then I was fortunate to get an email. You can't just call somebody in Hong Kong across the world. So they had to, set up a time to call, which definitely built the nerves up. But I, again, switched my SIM cards, talked to HR, and they said, we'd love to have you back for the following summer. So here I am, March of sophomore year, and landed a position for my junior year summer. So I hadn't even had my internship at Accenture. I'd had really zero internship experience, and I just checked another box off for my junior year internship. So it's a little bit different of a story. I unfortunately can't speak to the recruiting aspect of that. I'm grateful and lucky, and I acknowledge how I got to that position and it worked out. But I, again, sort of came about it from maybe a different angle than a lot of others within the school system in IBC.
That's probably the coolest recruiting story I've ever heard, and so interesting and impressive that you could handle yourself on like half a day time change, basically.
Coffee. I think that was the root of my coffee addiction. So
I'm sure. Yeah, I was gonna ask you about recruiting questions and advice you have for that, but you've got the cheat codes locked down.
Yeah, not a huge help. I still give advice to people. I hope they understand my background, where I'm coming from, because I didn't go through the same steps as many others that deserve to be heard. But I still enjoy giving advice, and I've understood the industry a lot better now and sort of understand what they're looking for. But yes, recruiting for me was a bit different of a game than a lot of others.
Maybe you could give just a couple tips, especially about the interview process and why you think, you mentioned it a little bit, but why do you think you succeeded in the interviews?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I would love to know the exact answer to. But from what I can perceive, I think I personally enjoy interviewing. So I think it's a time to talk about who you are, talk about how you may add value to a specific team, to a specific company. And it's also a time just to connect with people. So when I was interviewing for different positions, but especially investment banking, I just remember the night before that all these girls are cramming this M&I 400 guide, this holy grail of banking questions. And some of them were memorizing and just overall stressing out about it. And here I was, sort of excited to finally see American toothpaste again and stock up on it before I went to Hong Kong. So I was ready to, go out and walk around. And my mentality's always been, it's hard to, if you don't know something the night before and you're cramming, you're just going to stress yourself out for the next day. So if you don't know it the night before, you're most likely not going to be able to relay that information the following day. So I go into every interview, and it's important to me to not be scripted, to not have that word for word answer that they're looking for. I think that's something that sort of puts you into an automatic mold. And so when people are interviewing, I think they are trying to become this new person who knows all the answers, tells the person exactly what they want to hear, but I think that shoots themselves in the foot. So you kind of have to be yourself. I think it's important to connect with the person. So anytime I go into an interview, I think you want to look up that person, understand sort of what connections can you make with them, maybe on a deeper level that other people interviewing might not bring out. So if I was talking to an MD, I would look at their LinkedIn. I would research them. I'd see if they had been quoted in any articles. You have to do your due diligence before going into an interview, just so that you can kind of foresee what's going to happen and understand the person. I think a lot of it is about sort of engaging in the conversation as opposed to the piece of paper. Or, I mean, people are going to remember more about who you are than what they hear from you. So at the end of each interview, I want somebody to remember who I am. When they go back and talk to people, I want them to be able to say one thing about me that stood out from other candidates. So whether or not it came from Hong Kong was an easy one that kind of fell in my lap given Rothschild, but other interview positions as well. I think it's important that you figure out how you're going to establish yourself, because there are other candidates with similar backgrounds, similar interests, and I mean, word for word, the same answers if you're in banking to the technical question. So how can you sort of change that answer? How can you maneuver it into what they want to hear and what connects better with them, as opposed to what connects better for the business? So my advice to anyone is sort of do your due diligence, look up that person, understand how to connect with them, and then leave a lasting impression. So make sure that they have something in their mind. You want to set the bar for who you are, so that when they have all the other candidates, they are always comparing those candidates to you, and you basically need to outshine the others. And it's not again about how much information you know. It's not about what specific school you went to. I mean, it's about being you, and authenticity is going to be the key to hopefully landing the job of your dreams.
I think that's really good advice, and people should take that to heart for really any career and interview process that they go through. And we'll get to your Rothschild internship, but we're still at the end of sophomore year. So can you tell us about Accenture, what you did there, and what you enjoyed during that internship in Chicago?
So I worked for Accenture, sophomore summer, right in the heart of Chicago, and I was so excited about Accenture going in. I had researched different consulting firms, understood that most of them don't take sophomores. So we had 100 interns in the Chicago office, and 20 of them were sophomores and 80 of them were juniors. So heavily junior denominated, but it paid off. So going in to this, huge company, they always talk about how there's 425,000 employees around the globe. I mean, you're going into this huge network, and my specific role was to learn and to add value that I could, but it's basically an experience for me to learn more than what I can give them. So I was staffed on a business to business client, and from there, our client was basically very old fashioned. So they had different software systems set up that were not great. They were wasting money in terms of how they would market to people, how they would sell to people. I mean, different flaws in their system. And so Accenture's role and consulting as a whole, basically they see a company that has a problem. The company doesn't want to allocate resources towards fixing that specific problem. So that's where we as consultants come in. So I was there, and I merged right into this team that had already been there for the past 2 years, I want to say, which is, I learned at Accenture is not uncommon. So many of the clients that Accenture has have been on retainer for years. So this specific client in a northern Chicago suburb was working with Accenture for the past 10 years easily. And we were doing a lot of implementation work. And so my role specifically in this team was I would help transition them from, they use this sort of system called Tableau, which is, how to describe it, it sort of allows you to analyze different data and create different graphics based on that data. And so they were transitioning to a very similar platform called Power BI, which is a Microsoft owned one. And so we were transitioning them over, and then we were actually doing a bit of coding for them to figure out when this company had all these different clients, how can we narrow in on their top 10 clients to sell to? And then what products are these clients looking for? So we just basically took the aggregated data and wrote some basic code to figure that out. And then we would later present it to them. But my role was not that exciting, and the summer was interesting. It allowed me to see Accenture, but it also allowed me to see what I didn't like and what sort of workplace environment I wanted to work in. And so Accenture itself, as a company, they are great. They are digitally focused. They are ahead of the times in terms of AI and figuring out, the next steps in the technology sector. But I wasn't as impressed by this team that we just stayed in a conference room for 10 hours a day. We didn't have much interaction with the client. We'd been there before. I mean, these problems that the clients are having, it's just, I'm all about efficiency, and I just felt that there were some flaws within this entire system and how sort of the framework functioned for this specific summer. And so I kind of learned that consulting was for me, but I wasn't as interested in management consulting or implementation consulting. I would be looking more towards strategic consulting. So I started opening some new doors on other consulting firms after realizing that Accenture is great. I love their technology focus, but I wasn't interested in the day-to-day tactics of it. It wasn't as fulfilling to me, and I just didn't want to do that long term. So it was a great summer. I'm very thankful for how it worked out. Sophomore year especially, it was neat because I was one of the few sophomores, and so nobody knew that going in, who were the sophomores, who were the juniors. So it acted just like a internship like any other. But it was also at the back of my mind, on this back burner, was the thought that I previously signed for a banking internship the following summer. So the first day of this internship at Accenture, I just remember them saying, all right, your goal here is to get a return offer for the following summer or for full time. And I just kept quiet all summer. And that sort of, I didn't like that uneasiness. I didn't tell anyone that I had a different offer. And even when we had exit interviews, and you had to go through exit interviews at Accenture to say, how was your summer? What are you thinking about for next year? What location would you like to be at ideally? We'd love to have you back. It was very challenging. And so timelines were kind of tricky. It was a challenging summer in the aspect of battling two different internships. But overall, I'm thankful I could see the consulting field, understand sort of the frameworks that went into place, and then figure out where I wanted to go from there for the future.
Yeah, that is a very tough position to be in. And it sounds like you also still wanted to have maybe another experience in a more management consulting role. What was your thought process coming out of that internship? Did you wish that you had more time to do another internship in management consulting instead of banking or in addition to banking? What was your thought process there?
No, you definitely nailed that one on the head. I had held this idea of consulting at such a high regard, and it is a great field and people love it. But when I had that summer at Accenture, it didn't build up to what I thought it would be. And so I wasn't as excited about it. And then I just thought, okay, you know what? This is one company, obviously maybe a different culture, a way of doing business. And so I would have loved to try a summer working at what they call an MBB, so McKinsey Bain or BCG, a strategy consulting firm. And that to me would have been interesting to see how that worked. I just feel that there's not a lot of time in college, and you get to the end of your education and they say, okay, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? And that leaves so many possibilities that I don't necessarily want to just start with a company and then quit the next year, then move on and then quit and then move on. Like, to me, I want something that lasts, and I want to build those relationships and the clients and everything. And so I wish I could have had, another summer or an opportunity to learn more about the strategic consulting, the management consulting field. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. I was very excited for the finance field, investment banking specifically, just because I didn't know much about it, but it was something new, a different geographic location, and it sort of was I was excited to have a test run of it for the summer because I knew that however that would go, I would either be exerting all my energy into consulting full time or I would go into banking. And I figured at the end of the summer, I would know which one I wanted to do. I would start it away and it would be easy as that. But turns out it was not that way. To me, when I knew I didn't want to work at Accenture, it just allowed me to focus my resources and energy on networking and recruiting for consulting if I were to do it full time. So I kept those doors open. I also think it's very important to never burn any bridges in business. So I had written Accenture and told them, unfortunately, I couldn't take their offer, but I said, I'm testing out the finance field to see if that's something I want to do long term. However, I really enjoyed my summer and I look forward to staying in touch in the future. So I think it's very important to not burn those bridges. Don't close any doors on yourself because you never know what will happen in the future.
Mm-hmm. That's really good advice, and certainly what I've heard from a lot of people who are farther down their careers as well. So now we're in junior year, and surprisingly, I don't think you left the country during junior year. Can you talk about, you have a little bit about your major decision process, but for people going through college and considering a lot of different options for what areas they want to study, what's some advice that you have on how people can narrow down and really understand what areas they should end up majoring in, or what your thoughts are on certificates or minors as well?
Yeah, so majors are, I think we put a lot of emphasis on them, but I almost think we create them into this giant creature bigger than they really are. I don't think majors should limit you into what you want to do after college. It'll certainly give you a leg up, but I don't think it's a be all end all. But my major process, I've changed it multiple times. I would go into a major and be 110% positive. This is what I want to do. I'm super excited. I I changed my major 4 different times. So I'd even declared supply chain as a certificate. I'd met with, done the different prerequisites and met with people. I mean, I would definitely head down different avenues, but it would come to a point where I felt like I was forcing something that didn't occur naturally. And so it takes a lot of intrinsic like thinking and figuring out what classes are you most excited for, what subjects or maybe interests you have that you can relate real world experiences into the classroom. So I think when people try to force themselves into a major, I think you sort of come to this dissonance. You learn early on that it's not for you, but some people continue to fight through that. But to me, that just says you're going to hit burnout early on in your career. So in the major process, figure out what you enjoy doing, but also sort of figure out where you want to be in the end. So if consulting's for you, obviously look into the primary majors they take that of students from Wisconsin specifically that get into a company you're excited for. Or if you're looking at investment banking, then obviously know that finance is going to be heavily recruited for. So kind of figure out again your end long-term goal, where you want to be, and then make your way there, but also pursue what you're passionate about. So for example, I love the Italian language. I speak it, but I was conversationally fluent with it in Italy. And I mean, I could write it somewhat and other things, but I never was taught. I just picked up on it. And so coming into college, I knew that I might not use Italian in the US. I knew I probably won't use it within banking or whatever field I decided to go into, but it brought back good memories for me and I enjoyed learning about it in a classroom. And so that was a nice breath away from sort of the business school and from other people in sort of this small bubble. So when looking at majors, just come full circle, do what you enjoy, figure out where you want to end up, what sort of company, what sort of job, look into that and just go from there. So I think it's important to just take like one step at a time and figure out where's that end goal and how can you best get there.
I definitely agree. I think that's great advice. I think there is an overemphasis on majors, and I think it is most important that you're just really interested in your classes you're taking and not afraid to dive into them and not just get by. But after junior year, you get to go to Rothschild in New York. Can you tell us about that experience moving to New York and starting your investment banking internship there?
Yeah, New York to me was a huge jump, very exciting, but again, real nerves were in place. I felt like I was somebody who maybe didn't fit the picture perfect investment banker. And so I kind of fought that going into it a bit. Um, but I was pleasantly surprised when I hit New York and how comfortable I was at Rothschild. So from the get go, I had great conversations and connections from when I recruited sophomore year. And I was able to sort of dive back into those. And they helped kind of acclimate me into the company and provided a helping hand when I needed it. And so my summer as an investment banking analyst was difficult, challenging, but it was worthwhile and very fun and a great opportunity to learn about the industry. And so I was there with a class of about 30 others. New York had been well known to many others. They came from the East Coast. I mean, they came from all over. I actually sat next to a guy who came from Paris, so international as well, which was a huge aspect of Rothschild for me. But the summer experience was better than I had anticipated. So I felt comfortable within the company and who I was working for. From day one, I was thrown into a sell side deal where I was working on a team and we were sort of prepping this client from Austria, from Europe. And so again, just it all comes full circle in my story. But basically, it was really interesting because I was on this deal and I was like the first female along with the graduate student, and we were working on this women's health product. And so going through what they call the book, which is where we basically have the whole client figured out to a granular basis of not only their finances, but who they are, what makes, like, how to value them, figure out how they stand within the industry and their competitors and everything else. But there was, what I found interesting is that there was some information missing in terms of this women's info product and how they would market it. And so that was my first chance to actually speak up as an intern and to get my voice heard. And Rothschild as a company sort of ran with that and took it. And so my team was great in terms of allowing me to have responsibility. And each time I sort of spoke up or would work on a deal, I was able to sort of prove myself and continue working on other deals. But that was just like one example of a sell side deal. So throughout the summer, each day was very different. I would work on up to 5 deals at one time, but they wouldn't all be live or have much action to them. I did some internal projects as well. For some reason, the industrial team had me scrub comps for them, which is not a fun task for anyone that knows sort of what scrubbing comps means. So it's a very detail-oriented task, and they sort of just made a joke about it, and I just ended up doing all sort of the chemical companies, and there's just a lot going on there. So it was a fun summer that you have to push through the things you don't like, but you can also marinate in the things that you do. And I was fortunate to work with the coolest people I've ever met in my life, to have these opportunities with direct contact to executives I never thought would happen, and just sort of feel like I'd found my place and my curiosity was able to, sort of run with all our different deals. So I really enjoyed investment banking. I think people place a lot of emphasis on the fact that you have to come from a finance role or you have to come from sort of this very quantitative background. But as someone who majored in both finance and marketing, I found that I was using my marketing degree way more than my finance degree for this job. And so I think it's important that people perceive to know what the job is about or what they'll be doing, but you really don't know until you get there. And on a high level, you are just working, if you're, say, on like an M&A team, you're working to buy and sell companies. And so my marketing degree sort of kicked in. I was able to work on some retail teams, so that was neat. And I just had a great summer that I look forward to going back to for full time.
Sounds like you had an excellent experience, but you did come into that summer internship thinking that you may still want to recruit full-time for consulting. Was that out of the picture by the end of the summer?
No, it actually wasn't. So just like a week before our summer internships ended, I still had a recruiting networking phone call with somebody from Bain. And at this point, I'd sort of narrowed my search down and thought, you know what, Bain is such a cool company. This is someone I could see myself working for. I had talked to people in the offices and still practiced different case studies. And I just didn't even know until that very last moment to accept my offer that that's what I want to do. So I was going back and forth. I wagered the idea of working back in the Midwest in Chicago versus New York, and sort of my ultimate end goal of where I wanted to end up. So I was never sure. I even, again, we're talking about it, but I'm still not 100% sure. I didn't want to close any doors. I prep talk myself to say that I'm excited for banking, and I really am authentically, but it also doesn't mean that I'm not curious about consulting still. So I think it's important to not have that linear perspective. I kind of want to keep the doors open. I mean, there's other jobs as well I'm looking into in the future. So who knows really what will happen. I'm excited to where I am at now, but I'm also excited to where I could be in the future.
I do think being uncertain is just showing how curious you are, and I think a lot of people are in the same spot. But that was the junior year internship. Senior year, it's hard to believe, but you went abroad again to Brussels to work at the US mission to the European Union there. And first of all, I don't think many people know what that is. Could you tell us what it is and what compelled you to go work abroad in government?
So yeah, it's a very complicated field when you look into it. And I, for one, didn't know anything about it and just sort of leapt into the deep end with it. But growing up, I'd always had a strong inclination towards the government sector and towards using my voice for the public good. And so, whether that was in high school and doing different student organizations or leading different groups within my community, I was always very excited about this prospect of sort of going into the government work and reaching more people that way. And so all of a sudden, when I hit college and I didn't know what I wanted to do, I kind of felt that I was put on this, one-way track into finance early on and into, I mean, I first hit consulting, and then all of a sudden finance I'm signing up for before I've even reached my halfway point of college. And then just for people to say, okay, like this is what you're gonna do for the rest of your life. I wasn't content with that. I had these other side angles and thoughts swaying, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And so senior year came around, and I figured, you know what, I had the credits. I was gonna graduate college early, 3.5 years, which should be noted, which many are proud about, but my brother completed college in 3 years. So as a hyper competitive person, 3.5 was not great for me, but I acknowledged it and just thought, okay, I'll just graduate early. But then it's this next thought of what am I going to do during that time? How am I going to best, help myself for the future? What can I do? Is what it came down to. And so that's where I started researching different internships. I think I don't know what people assume. I'm I'm honestly just an ordinary person, but I hope to have extraordinary accomplishments. So I just started from just literally letter A, and I Googled how to work at a US embassy. So from there, I just sort of followed, obviously, this internet train and figured out exactly what could I do as someone in college who had an extra semester. I started looking at different co-ops. I started looking at other internships around Madison, figuring out what could I best do before I'm sort of pigeonholed within this finance sector full time. And that's where I found the Department of State. And they had this internship open with the only stipulation being that you had to have one additional semester of college after you completed it. So I filled out the application and I thought, all right, let me just put my name out here. Let's see. I figured it is fairly competitive. Here I am, a finance and marketing major, applying against all these other students who have grown up with diplomat parents, and the foreign service has been a dream for them. And I just thought, I would love to work at a US embassy. I would love to see what that means. And so I basically put my name out there, the application, and then ended up, again, being strategic about how I went about it. I applied to the US mission to the European Union, which, for those that are unfamiliar, basically is it's the business sector of Europe and the European embassies. And it's it's housed within Brussels, Belgium, which is the headquarters for different US missions. And so, like you were saying, there's 3 different missions within Brussels, Belgium, such as NATO, the US mission to Belgium as a bilateral country, and then the European Union. And I thought, okay, I'm going to apply to the European Union because as someone with a business background, this is probably my best chance of being selected versus many other students applying with international relations or, I mean, anything within like a 2-degree radius of that. So a lot of history majors, English majors. But finance and marketing, not a popular background. So I put my hand out there, see it would pick up anything. And I ended up getting a call back for this embassy. And, you know, from the first get-go, they were interested in my background in data analytics. And that's where I could talk to them about my sophomore summer, how I could be of help. And I sort of signed on for this huge position I didn't have much background on, didn't know much about, and sort of was excited to go through with it. So yeah, I ended up taking a semester entirely off of college. That was my fall of senior year, which again, I encourage anyone who is able to with the credits who's thinking about either graduating early or still a little uncertain about full-time careers. I encourage them to look into different internships. There's so many opportunities out there. It just is a matter of seizing them yourself.
Yeah, and we talked about what you did a little bit earlier this spring, which was a very interesting position analyzing social media and corresponding with the White House. Can you tell everyone about your role there?
Yeah, it was a wild time to say the least, and something that I will never forget. So yeah, I basically was hired with this data analysis background, and they were thinking, all right, let's get this young tech savvy person to come in and help us basically with Russian disinformation. And so when I was working in Brussels, Belgium, they are sort of the midway point, the liaison between Washington, D.C. and the 28 US embassies. And so I specifically worked in the Brussels Media Hub, was the communicator and sort of the voice of the European Union that would help push it out to these other embassies. So one of my first main projects was allowing me to come in and say, listen, we host these different conferences, these telephonic press briefings, these different high-end ranking officials will give a speech about a current topic or US foreign policy. And directly after they're done giving the speech, these newspaper reporters from all over the world would go and write articles, and they would just be obviously quoting this person, saying different US foreign policy, like often by the playbook, as they call it in Washington, D.C. So they would be taking this information as reporters and pushing it out to their countries. Well, there comes a point where this information that is getting dispersed can often be interrupted by a third party, such as the Kremlin or the state-controlled media in Russia. So they wanted my help in figuring out, we have all this data on all these articles, and they had coded a few programs. So I was just helping to run these programs, and they coded these programs to say, like, to translate the news articles, and it would allow me to see, okay, what is the general sentiment of these newspaper articles of all these countries? What are the top 5 countries that are having the most articles on this specific issue? And from there, I would have to take what was originally said, what was the end result, and where in this sort of dispersion did the US narrative get switched. So it was up to me to sort of find this mole, this sort of rat, in terms of where did they switch the US foreign policy for something that we wanted to be this, say, happy sentiment or this positive sort of association with maybe this technology, say like 5G. But along the lines, when somebody else comes in, they may swap that to say, all right, this is not good for our country. We don't want this. And I mean, it's obviously well known now, the term disinformation, but it's basically this idea that information is getting changed to the consumer viewpoint. And so there's manipulation going on. There's sort of a war on information at this moment. And I was just there as someone who is helping to track this down and sort of get ahead of it.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly interesting. After a semester of studying disinformation, what are your thoughts on how we can combat it? Or are we stuck with this problem forever?
I hope not. And I'm worried, honestly, for the November election. It's a real issue, and people are naive to it and ignorant, and they don't understand. And what I worry about, though, is that these constituents and people, we're all reading the news all the time, but we're all so persuadable. And so you might read an article and you need to, again, ask yourself who produced it, what's the agenda behind it, have they produced other articles, and figure out for yourself the editorial of it. And so I think there's so much information now that's being tossed around and it's hurting everyone. So even in terms of the pandemic, I think people are confused about what to listen to, what to believe. My own viewpoint of this is that's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And I think, though, the number one thing that people can do is educate themselves. We've all gone through high school. We've probably had teachers who talk to us about primary and secondary information, talk to us about how everyone's biased. And so understand what somebody's angle that they're getting at when they write something, and don't just push it forward without understanding that. So I think a lot of people are all super into having this idea and wanting to spread it around to their friends and get everyone on board. But if that idea is flawed from the beginning, you are just creating and perpetuating this system. So don't be persuadable. Basically, look into sources, understand the information you're reading, and in every single article you read, whether it's a accredited source or even a source you've never heard about before, understand what is the point of the article. Is it really to inform you, or is it to receive some sort of monetary goal in mind? Does it have a political angle to it? And thankfully, the tech giants are starting to step in and take a different role in all this, which is good. In terms of Facebook, they've actually just started speaking up about state influenced media. So anytime a news article may be produced from them, again, they'll pop up with a screen. Same thing that would happen if you produce or try to perpetuate wrong information. It'll basically pop up with a gray screen that says, hey, this is state controlled media and we believe they are pushing a specific agenda. So note that moving forward. And I'm excited to see that is helping, or that should hopefully help, but it's up to each one of us individually. Just understand what you read is important and understand the editorial viewpoint of it.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a fine line what the tech companies are towing right now. I think certainly it's a great idea to tag the source and make sure people are informed on where they're getting their information. But much beyond that, it's a very difficult position to be in when faced with blocking and deleting content and ensuring people's personal liberties. All right, so we've made it basically to the end of your college career, and I've got a list of quick questions that I think will be insightful into your personality if you have time to go through some of them.
Shoot away. I'm ready.
All right. What was your favorite class in college?
Cryptocurrencies with Brad Chandler. Easily the best course that broke down what cryptocurrency is, blockchain. I think that's obviously a turning point that everyone should know about, and did a great job. So I guess not a short answer. I'll keep them shorter from this point moving forward, but
No, that's good. Definitely add some commentary if you want. Favorite book?
My favorite book that is obviously very popular now is probably Educated. I just think there's so many new perspectives and things you can learn about just people within the United States and how there's different income disparities, there's healthcare, and all these different huge issues that need to be addressed. And so Educated by Tara Westfield right now is probably my favorite.
Mm-hmm. What about favorite podcast?
I have a tie. How I Built This and Robin Hood Snacks. So two great ones, depends what I'm in the mood for. How I built this, obviously great. Love hearing in depth about different people. Also, wait, I should couple that with Oprah Super Soul is same thing as how I built this, except it's more on the emotional side in terms of how someone thinks, how someone reacts, but it's a very in-depth interview and sort of breaks down the person from what they're doing now, where they start, and what do they see for the future. So how I built this, Oprah Super Soul, and then Robin Hood Snacks, super easy. It's like 18, 20-minute episodes. Two guys post IB finance, and just highly encourage anyone that's interested in about like the markets to listen to that one.
Yeah, Guy Raz is my idol, of course. And
I love him so much. So
I got to listen to the Oprah
that
one, though. I haven't done that. What about favorite hobbies right now or just in general?
Right now, my favorite hobby, honestly, is probably running. I've been like, that's where I feel the most free, and I just get on these thought trains that just go into what, I don't know, just random things. And so running is one of my favorite hobbies. But also back to the nonfiction reading, probably. I've really been into different nonfiction books, and I've probably like passed over 25 books at this point, just quarantine. And so I love just cranking through those now that I have the time and sort of not many responsibilities.
This may be the same answer, but do you have any physical or mental health habits that you think could benefit everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I would preach running. I love it. I think I just feel so good after I go for a run. So I've started hearing about all these 5 a.m. clubs, about all these top, people in the world wake up at 5 a.m. and get on with their day. And so I've started like waking up earlier and just going for a long run. And then at night, I do podcast walks. So I would encourage anyone who's into podcasts to go outside. Obviously, I would stress be outside as much as possible. And then figure out podcasts you're into. So that's kind of been my main thing this quarantine as well. But figure out different podcasts that you're interested in, or people that you want to follow within different podcast platforms. But then just go on those long walks. I encourage people to get lost on them and just continue listening and to not think. And so to me, that's been the healthiest habits I have. But then also to get involved. I think community work is so important, especially understanding the community issues that you might have. And so that's where I try to get involved there. And again, you just feel fulfilled. You get to have those interactions. You get to talk to people, and whatever you can do to understand a new perspective and way of life is super important.
You keep answering my next question, I think, but we'll see if this is a different answer or the same.
Natural transitions.
What's your best tip for making the world a better place that everyone can do?
I would say get involved, listen, and educate. So I think it's very important that you need to think always beyond yourself. I think, we're taught in school and growing up, and especially college, we're all in this bubble, and you can fight that as much as you want. I tried to fight that by going abroad, but at the end of the day, I mean, I'm shaped by the people that I was surrounded by. And so I think it's important to sort of fight that bubble. So like college, for example, and Granger was this small bubble. But when I lend a hand in my local community pantry, I'm there then, bringing food and listening to the people and understanding what are their main needs at the time and how can I help them, and sort of learning that your bubble may be a safe space. You might have the resources you need, but you need to look beyond that. And so figure out if there's a community need, step into that role. And then I think it's important too. I mean, it's not about fame and notoriety, it's about impact. And so you don't have to be, the name and the face of something. You can just still help one person have an impact. You can still, do one little task for somebody and make their day. So whatever you can do to get involved, and then listen to that person and educate yourself on different issues at hand, which is obviously very prevalent right now. And I think it's important that you understand your place in different issues, and then educate yourself for how to sort of help make the problem. And then come up, or like how you are helping to perpetuate the problem, and then how you can come up with solutions to fix it.
Well, I think that's an excellent spot to close. So thank you so much, Jenna, for coming on today.
Thank you. No, this is fun.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I'll be releasing a new episode each week, so please subscribe and rate the podcast. It's really helpful for me as I try to expand to more listeners. I'd also love to hear any feedback or questions you may have. My email is in the About section of the podcast. I'm Wally Estenson, and you've been listening to the Wally Pod.